This is Eddie Wilson welcoming you to Austin Roots, a podcast about how Austin, Texas became flavored the way it is.
And this is Dr. Jason Mellard, a cultural historian, doing my best to connect the old and the new in this city we call home.
Or the center of the musical universe.
Jesse Sublett first took center stage in the Austin scene as a musician with the early punk bands The Skunks and the Violators. While continuing to hold down a musical career on bass, his star also rose in the city's literary scene, first with a trilogy of rock critic murders novels, through his memoir Never the Same Again, and as a historian with books on Esther's Follies, and, together with Eddie Wilson, a fine book on the Armadillo World headquarters. Now, in addition to all of this, one of our primary concerns today is to talk about his place as one of Austin's primary chroniclers of true crime, with books like 1960s Austin Gangsters, and a new work on corruption and law enforcement in the 1970s. Welcome, Jesse. How you doing?
I'm good. Our topic of looking at these stories of old Austin, lots of folks know people like LBJ and Janis Joplin, Kenneth Threadgill and Darrell Royal. But what does the 60s history of Austin look like once we stir in less celebrated, less known characters like Tim Overton and the Overton Gang? How did you first get interested in this story?
I accidentally came across a news clipping that told the whole history in a nutshell in about 1,000 words or less. It just so happened that I was already investigating. It started in August 1976. And so I was looking through the microfilm, and there was a story about a longtime Austin thug named Travis Schnautz, who had been murdered as he nodded out in his office chair at D.W. Rugg massage parlor. 2 shotgun blasts did the trick. They said that he was had formerly been a member of the Overton Gang and a confidant of Timmy Overton, the leader of that gang. Their heyday was the 1960s. This was, about 10 years later. So some of these guys were still around, even though the gang had been decimated. And the police were pretty worried that the gang was getting active again together. Some of the remnants were doing stuff around town. There was a story about that murder with a great photo of the guys from the funeral home taking the body out on a stretcher, covered in a sheet, thankfully. Below that was a story that said Ghosts of the Overton Gang, 1960s Austin Underworld. This hit me like a brick. I looked at that. I didn't know anything about it. It mentioned all this weird stuff. Hattie Valdez being the main Austin madam, that there was even a Time magazine article that mentioned Hattie's house of prostitution, and that the main attraction there was a gal with skunk tattoos on her butt, and she was the girlfriend of Timmy Overton. I thought, Jesus. This kept going on and on. He was an ex-football player and Golden Gloves boxer, but he went into this life of crime, and there was this Austin Underworld. All this was new to me, so I started jamming on it, getting as much information as I can for all about 2 months' time before I called Eddie, because Eddie and I were already pals by then, and we had been hanging out, and I knew he was a fountain of information. And I finally called him, and I mentioned this to him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember where I was when that Time magazine hit the stand." And so I went to UT Library and quickly found it, and sure enough, it was a great little article, which you wouldn't expect in an article introducing the nation and the world to the home of the new president in January 1964. If you were in the know here in this town, you probably would go, "Yep, that's right," because, LBJ was associated with a lot of shady doings, and there was plenty of shady business in town. Hattie, she was a great businesswoman, and she had been in the business since the 1920s. She had had houses all up and down South Congress Avenue. She was frequently in the news. The way they wrote about her was like she was an unknown quantity. People seemed to love her, and the bankers loved her. She had accounts with every bank in town. She bought a lot of real estate. She drove always had a new Cadillac. And then there were the other madams, Peggy and Evelyn and Dolores, who were more colorful. Peggy was always in trouble. She and her boyfriend were always getting in fights, and her trying to run over him shooting up her Cadillac. So that's the world that Timmy Overton gravitated into from UT football, which he was in with a scholarship for 2 years. In the second year, he got arrested one too many times for, if I say hot check charges. He was sort of a mastermind. He would get a hold of a check writing machine from a burglary of a business and then crank out a lot of payroll checks. So he'd done that at least twice. And so Darrell Royal, who was on his second year, the head coach and head of the UT football program, gave him the boot, and Timmy ended up doing about 6 months in Huntsville. And he felt betrayed. He felt that Darrell should have had his back because, UT football players, they were royalty, so to speak.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Terry Allen song on Lubbock on Everything, of the football player gone bad on Texas Tech, right? He gave up prayer, growed his hair, and said, "Football days are done."
Yeah, that's a fun song.
Eddie, I know you're really interested in this history. When growing up in Austin, when did you first become aware of this cast of characters?
Probably as I was going from middle school to high school. They were all getting out of high school. It was back in the bare knuckle days. It was Timmy's assassination may have been the turning point when people quit fist fighting and started shooting point blank. Everybody knew who all the tough guys were. Every couple of years there was a new super bad guy who was known for being able to whip everybody else in town, and they would meet out at the place below the low water bridge.
Rock quarry was one thing.
Well, that was one. Pull the cars in a big circle, turn on the headlights, and the big guys get out and bang each other up. And then it all turned to the little guys with the Pachuco shoes and no heels and the toes turned up. And Larry Culbreth became a whole new kind of threat. Larry was so mean because little bitty tiny guy, little skinny guy, and he ate candy bars all the time, and his teeth were rotten. And so the reason he was so mean was that he had a terrible toothache all the time. It carried a piece. And he was told by the Austin police, so the story went, that he had just assassinated Timmy. He wouldn't be in any trouble at all. But he blew away the prostitute that Timmy had with him. And so for that reason, they made him leave the state. And so he went to Vegas working for the Fort Worth Gambler?
Yeah, he was a blackjack dealer for Benny Binion. So the Benny Binion and Herbert the Cat days were just like yesterday to the Austin gangsters we're talking about. Binion ruled Fort Worth and Dallas and killed anybody who got in his way. So they called him Little Larry. He was arrested in Alabama, brought back to Dallas, where he had killed Timmy and Wanda Jewell, his prostitute. Timmy had just released from federal prison for 2 months when he was getting ready to take over notorious Fort Worth booking. Something went wrong. He and Larry were planning some stuff, different stories about the motivation for the hit. And little Larry jumped out. He was in a car waiting for Timmy and shot them both. And so he got 10 years probation for killing 2 people. And so how did all this relate to the Austin music scene? Well, one thing is that these guys love the nightlife. If there was a cool happening club, they were there. And one of them was Ernie's Chicken Shack on East 11th Street. They would go there and tip the waitresses $100 and the musicians $100. Just party, revel in their reputation. There was gambling there. It was kind of a reservation, kind of a pink zone where the police didn't enforce it. They let Charlie Gilden run the place. And so they hit all the night spots all the time. That's one way. But if you were a musician like I was in the early 70s, these clubs would crop up out of nowhere, really decked out and expensive furnishings, and they would pay the band way too much. And you just knew it was drug money. You didn't have to see anything, you just knew it was. And sometimes we did see it.
I'm not going to forget again to ask you if you named the skunks after the tattoos on Overton's old lady's butts.
I wish I would have thought of that. I would have said that a long time ago. No,
It's time for some revisionist history. I think you should, yeah.
Who's going to argue with me? Let's see.
So I want to go back to Ernie's Chicken Shack a little bit and thinking about that place. So in what had been the segregated black region of East Austin, in the book you get into some of the interesting reasons why Ernie's Chicken Shack probably exists or was open, like who owns it and how that happened. Could you get into that a little bit and like how it fits in this sort of geography of these East Austin blues clubs?
Yeah, this just occurred to me. Brown versus Ford was 1954. There wasn't much trouble integrating in Austin, right? In the school, it went pretty smoothly. So anyway, we had integration happening, and I believe that had something to do with all these white college students getting interested in the East Side, because that's about the time that the East Side Renaissance started happening. Suddenly, there were all these clubs over there. College students would fill the clubs, especially Charlie Hilton's play, Charlie's Playhouse, and also the New Orleans Social Club, which was east of Congress, and that's really all it took to be East Side. And there were transvestite shows. The mainstay of the music there was the Jets, Blues Boy Hubbard and the Jets. They were like a blues band, but actually they played the top 40. Charlie would bring them set list on Friday, and they were supposed to learn all those songs. It was a bumper to bumper going up East 11th Street.
I think a big part of the pressure was the TABC and the 21-year-old drinking requirement. And so there was just less pressure on the East Side. And I mean, the Armadillo lived in fear of being busted for underage stuff.
By a little bit later in the 60s, they were booking some of the psychedelic rock bands that would have trouble getting booked elsewhere a little bit. Speaking about Ed Gwynn, Conqueroo would be playing like the IL Club. The guys who founded the Vulcan Gas Company, some of their first shows they were doing at the Miller Auditorium on the East Side too.
Yeah, gravitated toward that. The reason that the Chicken Shack happened, the white kids were taking over Charlie's Playhouse. They would book all the tables in advance, and the neighborhood could not get in. And Charlie says they had more money than the neighborhood people, and so there was friction there. So he opened. The place was called Cheryl Ann's when he first took it over, but he changed the name to Ernie's Chicken Shack. And considerably further east, and Timmy Overton and the guys were not worried about going there. In fact, Charlie treated it like royalty.
And you point out, too, that he names it after a famous sort of South Side Chicago business as well, right?
That's my theory, but it just seems obvious to me because Ernie, I forgot his last name, but he was a character in Chicago in the 30s, and he was really successful. He started his Chicken Shack, and they delivered in red cars with the rooster on the side, and went around in a Duesenberg with a chauffeur, married a white woman. He was really big, and he was a major supporter of the NAACP. The great black newspapers of the time were always writing about him. Recently, I interviewed Joyne Bailey, who was a Baptist preacher, homicide detective. In 1976, was elected sheriff, and he was Ann Richards' security chief, and lots of other stuff. He's a cop that everybody likes.
Good man.
Yeah, he was a homicide cop in the 70s. His night beat for a while was East 11th and Weberville Road. That's where all the action was. And so one night, Charlie Gilden was having a fight with one of his girlfriends, and it was getting out of hand. Police were called. This girl was beating him up, and he ended up grabbing the cop's radio and calling for help, and saying, "This is Charlie Gilden. I need help out here."
So let's walk through this geography of Austin again. We've been spending some time on the East Side, and one of the things that I really like about your accounts, I'm a real geek for when you sprinkle in addresses and you have all kinds of photographs. This is almost like an alternate geography of Austin, and a lot of the landmarks are still around. They're places that you wouldn't think that high drama had occurred there, but you have these compelling stories attached to these places. So let's talk about the Overton Gang's Austin a little bit. What was the city like for them? What were some of the sites they're associated with, that kind of thing?
It was a time when, you could see the Capitol from everywhere, which is funny to think about now. It's just quaint. It's so far back now. But almost as soon as you crossed the river, that was South Austin. And South Austin just had this connotation, kind of like Chinatown. Well, there were so many joints, including the Continental Club, which opened in 1954, and the Ostex Lounge. Down at the 3400 block, across from the Bel Air Motel, which is still there, still looking pretty funky. In that block, Hattie had a house for a while. That was in the 50s. All the wild stuff happened past Ben White. So Hattie had a place at 5900 block, which is not there anymore. It's all apartment buildings. It was a house set back from the road. She would sell beer and had a jukebox. That was going for a while in the 50s into 1960, when it was finally closed down by injunction, and then it burned down the following year. It's further south. It's now a truck rental place. I think it's the 8700 block. There was a place called the M&M Courts. Before that, it was the Siesta Courts. And Hattie already had that up and going when the other place was shut down. The sheriff would say, we shut them all down. But, it wasn't really true, right? And these places would open back up again like a couple of days later, usually. That was a real happening place. It was a big money earner for the girls. The near East Austin, East 1st Street is where a lot of these guys grew up. It was not a barrio type neighborhood. There were all those Victorian houses still there and family businesses. It was mixed Mexican and white. But a lot of the white guys that grew up there went to prison. To be an ex-con in that neighborhood wasn't unusual. And that's where Timmy grew up. They had also lived in Chalmers Court. It was one of the first federally subsidized housing projects.
Well, and they recently torn most of it down. There's very little of it left right now. That one, and they're about to do the same to the Rosewood one up the street from it. Yeah.
I hate it. Going over there, it's such a cliche. Say, that was there yesterday.
Yeah, we all know this, but those are some of the very first public housing projects that were brought in because LBJ, as a freshman legislator, was already working the room.
Yeah, there's a big spread just recently about the old housing projects being torn down.
So a lot of the white guys that grew up there grew up tough. They were fighters. They were fist fighters. A lot of them were great athletes. The preppy kids, like Mike Cotton, they went to UJH, University Junior High. The guys from Allen Junior High, they beat UJH in G5, and they were really psyched about that. And then when they all filtered into Austin High, there was some friction there because it was just weird because the west side of Austin was well-to-do and really well-to-do, and the east side was very poor, and you had those two extremes in one high school suddenly together, and there was some class warfare going on. People just fought more then, but
yeah, and this would have been around the same time as the moral panic around juvenile delinquency. It feels like a lot of the style and the behavior that we're talking about fit that narrative a little bit.
Yeah.
That was the same period that I was in middle school at UJ University Junior High and started going to 6th Street on Saturdays and then going to Liberal Outlet. Know that that's where I met Chip and Dale, the girls that mimed the songs on KDBC. They were very liberal with their prices. He found a Switchblade that was $2.95. They could ask the Lebanese owner, and he'd knock it down to $1.95. And so gave you a chance to use Chip and Dale as middle people. So I could come out of there sometimes just armed to the teeth.
And then you would sell it?
I'd go to UJH, and that was after Allen had burned down. So Allen had to come in at noon 30. We had to start at 7:30 in the morning, and then when they came, we had to get out early. They would come in, and there was about a 30 to 45 minute period on those front steps that you could just stand there with contraband and sell it to those kids that were coming into school. Just happened to, discover the supply source earlier than a lot of them, I guess.
So we're getting a sense of sort of the Austin in which Tim Overton came of age and is coming up, and we've talked a little bit about where he ends up, but we need to fill in the middle now. The Overton Gang, who this is, what they do. How does it come to be seen as kind of a criminal organization?
Well, Timmy's older brother, Charles, had gone to prison first. He went to prison in 58, I think, for bank robbery. He came out, and I think he may have helped corrupt Timmy, but there are other older thugs who were safecrackers and pimps and all this stuff in the life. Timmy started running with them, and when he got sent up straight, the Longhorns to Huntsville and he came back, and he was in the scene. He was a gambler. These guys were card mechanics. If they went to join a poker game, the smart people would get up and leave, because they knew that these guys had all these tricks and they were going to take all your money. It was gambling. It was prostitution. It was drugs. Timmy was smuggling drugs. They would get a crew together of usually 4 people, and they would go to these small town banks, but a town with a population of less than 2,000 that was not the county seat. So they didn't have any local police there. If something happened, they had to call the county seat to get them there. And they preyed on these towns. They would have these door rattlers would go around the businesses and check the door. The back door would be something that a junior high kid could pick the lock or something. They'd get in there and they peel the ball. The safe deposit boxes were very easy to break into. They were fishing tackle boxes. Literally, that's what they were. They were easy to pry open, and one guy or 2 guys were busting those open and emptying the contents on a blanket. At least 2 other guys were working on the money safe. Sometimes they could get in, but usually they didn't. They weren't able to. They'd have to give up. The safe deposit boxes were off big score. They would have coin collections, gems, and a lot of times pornography and bonds. And so they just went around and preyed on all these small towns in Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas. I mean, they might make only like $5,000 on this small town bank, and the next night they would rob a bookie of $50,000. They were voracious. They lived off the land. So a lot of these guys came from West Texas towns. They'd work at an oil rig for a while and get tired of that, run with these guys for a while. And so these guys came together, and Timmy was charismatic. He was smarter than the usual thug. Maybe some of that football thing was still gave him a kind of a charisma.
It's interesting hearing you talk about it, because it sounds sort of like some of the same outlaws that in the 1930s became almost folk heroes. You make a point of the fact that, the Overton Gang are not people to be romanticized.
True, they did get romanticized. I mean, people got a kick out of reading about them, and they were larger than life. They were always driving Cadillacs, and it's hilarious how many of them were used car salesmen. They would have several Cadillacs. They would score and buy a car, and then a couple of days later come back and buy one just like it. One thing was that they needed good cars that could travel and have big trunks. Also, a car was good for converting to currency when you needed money in a hurry, like for bail or something. That's another reason why they wore, real expensive watches, chunky gold rings.
Speaking of cars, too, one of the other geography connections that I like is that they are connected to a mechanics business that has, certain benefits to them. One of those garages was later part of the Emos complex, one of the big clubs in the 90s, right?
Oh, yeah, right. You're correct. Yeah. Timmy's father, one of his early predecessors to the main shop, was there. Timmy's friend and fellow high school football lineman, Manuel Estrada, his family had a produce supply company adjacent to them, right? Manuel was one of my first big interviews. And he, like everybody who grew up with Timmy, cherished that memory. They didn't wring their hands and say, I don't know what went wrong with him. They were not judgmental. That's the thing.
Yeah, the story, too, one of the things about them being, like I said, less remembered or less celebrated, part of this Austin narrative is that there is a quality where they weave in and out of all different kinds of other important Austin stories. We started with this notion of the Time magazine cover where, the Overtons kind of get, like, that story gets a nod in there in the Hattie Valdez world. There are a bunch of these, and one of them early on that's really interesting is the connection to Charles Whitman and the tower shooting. Because Whitman, too, is someone who always gets mentioned in these stories, but it's almost like you don't know him before, right? He's not a part of the world before, but you learn something about who he is in these connections.
Well, Timmy had just come back from his first term in Huntsville in this late summer of 61 Whitman had just started at UT, had just registered for his first term, so they were very tight. Nick Kroll and some other guys who were in a fraternity, they couldn't play cards anymore, but they found out that there was a guy at good old Wooten dorm, which is pretty much a big Austin landmark. He was the monitor or proctor.
Like an RA, like a residential assistant?
Yeah, so like he was supposed to make sure that there was no gambling and other stuff like that going on. But he fancied himself as a hot poker player, and he was a lookout and organizer of these games. And so he started playing cards, and then Timmy and little Larry and some other Overtons show up. So did the late Bill Whitliff. He said it wasn't fun, I was kind of kidding around with him about it. He said, no, it wasn't fun. It wasn't funny. Whitman was so dense. He didn't realize that. He thought that he could beat these guys. And so he lost a bunch of money to them. He paid them with a check. And then the next morning canceled it. Timmy and one of his brothers, I think it was Darrell, would go around to the dorm looking for him and saying, you need to pay up. Whitman, again, so dense, buys a 357 Magnum and starts carrying it around with him at all times. He's ready for him. That confrontation never happened because Timmy and his older brother, Charles, got busted in Dallas like a month later and both of them sent back to the pen. So by the time they got out, I guess they forgot about it. Whitman wasn't around for very long. He got in trouble and his scholarship yanked. It's just wishful thinking, but if they had met up again, Whitman wouldn't have been alive to go up in the tower.
I know maybe there's another alternate history where we talk about how awful the Overton Gang was, but yeah, okay, at least, right? But
yeah,
I guess we wouldn't even talk about it because we wouldn't have known what Whitman had done because he would have been removed.
Yeah, but yeah, you hit on something with the folk hero type thing. I mean, it was a real life folk tale back then. People loved picking up the paper and reading about the Overton Gang.
It's a little bit of an aside, but could y'all fill me in a little bit more on Nick Kroll? Like, he's someone, too, I feel like he shows up in the oddest places and the oddest stories.
Nick was involved in politics. He was a political operator. He was an assistant to Ben Barnes. They were together in '68 during the Democratic Convention when they ran into a big crowd of protesters. The car wasn't moving, and so Nick pulled out a pistol, and they got moving again. I joked with him. He's a big gun collector, but he's a great guy. I mean, anyway, he's done a lot of lobbying to legalizing gambling.
He was all about horse racing or dog racing.
All right, so someone who's a character in kind of the nightlife side, but also... And there's a lot of this, like, two sides of the same coin that go on in looking at this world. One of the other big themes in dealing with this true crime and the Austin story is the ways in which law enforcement engages, right? So I think that there's also this big theme of, both abuse of power or, again, two sides of the same coin. And you see that a lot, I think, in the Overton Gang story. So can we talk a little bit about that, like how law enforcement engaged with the Overtons?
The vagrancy statute was a big thing, and it was basically you could arrest anybody you wanted. Timmy Overton could be driving his Cadillac with $1,000 worth of jewelry on him. He had a business card that said he was a used car salesman, and they would charge him with vagrancy. That often meant not just a trip downtown and a court date, but it could get shaken down, something like that. It was harassment, basically. Things like that, and that would happen to pimps routinely. You see that side of the criminal justice system and law enforcement that's just out to squash the marginal people.
It's one of Dave Richards' biggest feathers in his cap.
Exactly.
He overturned the vagrancy statute.
Yeah, right. And also the drug thing, like getting tormented for having a joint. Sent to prison. So, drugs back in the 60s made outlaws of a whole generation.
It's often the same personnel, too, who are surveilling and harassing, like the 13th floor elevators, or right. Surveilling and harassing, civil rights and anti-war activists. It's kind of the same tactics.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. The guys who surveilled the 13th floor elevators from the minute they form when they were rehearsing and hadn't even played a gig. It's kind of the flip side of the coin, and
just that love of guns, I guess.
And it's a class thing with a lot of outlaws. They never had a chance to grow up and be a nuclear scientist or a lawyer, even finish high school. You got to empathize with them. And I do.
And you see that a lot in terms of organized crime. If you think back to like the era of the Prohibition, that's why, so many of the big families in the East Coast were, Italian or Irish or Jewish. It was people who maybe there were roadblocks to them having, professional mobility in other parts of life, African Americans as well. And so for these guys growing up on, East First Street in Chalmers Court, you're right that they saw an avenue and they took it.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they were enlightened either. So, like, the sexual part of it was, it's very unpleasant to think about. A lot of these girls, unfortunately, they got pregnant at any age before they got married in high school, and they were pariahs. If they had the kid, their life was over. They might end up marrying somebody, maybe the boyfriend, or probably not, just probably somebody just to have a husband. That didn't last. And so then they had a kid and they couldn't get a job. And so they would knock them around,
Yeah, it's very much a story of exploitation and abuse. And, it's interesting to try to think about people like Hattie Valdez. We might sort of flesh her out a little more here. The world of madams who were also involved in that exploitation, but sometimes could also perhaps protect. And they, Hattie herself had a very strange relationship with the Overtons and some of the other pimps, right?
Yeah. Well, if you were a madam, you got robbed a lot. If you were a successful madam, and she got robbed, probably several times a year. And these guys, they had, I don't know if you'd say they were friends, but they had a relationship with her, and yet they would waylay her when she came home and tie her up and beat her up, and until she told them where her big stash of money was. And several times she was robbed of like $10,000 or $20,000, and she still had plenty. She her house on Riverside had secret chambers and stuff that I don't know if anybody generally knew about, but there was that. And they would do that. They would beat her up, and then they would see her, a couple of days later, and she would say, "Oh, I don't know why you had to hit me so much." And Jerry Ray James, the Notorious, would say, "Oh, I love you." So they had this weird relationship.
A lot of ugliness to it, and it's interesting with someone like Hattie because, as you suggested earlier, she was almost like a civic leader in her own way, right? She was a public figure in the city. Eddie, I remember this was some of the first earlier history of Austin that you instructed me in. Hattie Valdez always seemed like someone you like to talk about and explain who she was and how she fit into the city. Her will left a whole lot of jewelry and some money and maybe some real estate to the girlfriend and wives of a bunch of state legislators. I did not know that one. Yeah, I can't remember where I found out all that, but she, she passed around a lot of bling.
Yeah, she was a huge donor to charities every year, and the neighborhood kids loved going there knocking on her door for Halloween because she'd give them money instead of candy.
And you said she had a long career. Did you say go back to the 20s?
Yeah, to the 20s. That I got that date from the oral histories of Emmett Shelton, because he knew her way back, and he said he'd known her before he got married, and that was in 28, I think. And in the 30s, she was selling beer. She would have slot machines in her places also, and Also, she was involved. She had wrestling matches up there on Riverside Drive. There was a guy named Jesse Wilson who was a fight and wrestling promoter, and she had an outdoor ring there, and they would have boxing and wrestling. But it was really funny. It's just worth researching just to read about it in the language that they talked about it. But it was called the Riverside Arena, or Wilson's Riverside Arena, and weekly matches, several days a week, and some of this also, I think, was connected to the walkathon that they had. I think it was in the Guytown area, and walkathon was when they would have those marathon dance thing, and it was illegal to do that. But at least some of the matches were held at the old walkathon, and think this was all new to me. I think I started learning about this stuff after I wrote the book, the 1930s aspect. But it's real.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, the span of time that she covered and sort of this, the nightlife demimonde of Austin, Texas. Such a big figure. How does the Overton Gang become unwound? I think we've previewed that a little bit with where things end up, but they're on these sprees doing bank burglaries all across sort of Texas and the Great Plains. Making a lot of money, getting busted sometimes, but the big bust doesn't seem like it's really on the horizon, and then things kind of go south.
Yeah, starting in '64. Oh yeah, their signature heist was Timmy's act of getting revenge against Darrell Royal, Thanksgiving Day, 1964. When the Longhorns are playing their annual grudge match against A&M, Timmy and the boys slipped into the UT Co-op, which was a big ticket outlet, and also one of the places you could cash a check. And so it was a perfect time to hit that place because they hadn't gone to the bank yet. So they went in and hit that place, and it wasn't discovered until Friday morning, and they had to scramble all over and try to find out. They learned about the heist without knowing where it happened from the eavesdropping bugs that they had in Timmy's apartment. They heard them counting on his cash, and they knew that they had hit somewhere. And then once they got up past $20,000, they knew it was a pretty big score, and so they didn't find out about it until Friday morning when the places opened up, and so that was a big deal. The co-op people wouldn't even divulge the exact amount that had been stolen, but the police sources said it was the biggest cash burglary in Austin history. So we don't know. It could have been as much as 60 grand, I think.
During the Thanksgiving A&M game.
Yeah. So that was a big embarrassment thing. And so these guys, the task force was already on them with the bugs and, pressing informants this way and that. And so they went in for the long haul and just started collecting stuff on them. And it was difficult because at that time, police agencies didn't cooperate with each other. Like you'd have a sheriff here, wouldn't help anybody, the feds or neighboring jurisdiction or anything. So it was difficult, but after 2 years, they had a lot of they had a lot of little bits that they could string together for a conspiracy case, but they didn't have the smoking gun, so to speak, until the guys hit a bank in Moody, Texas, up in the Panhandle, population 200, and today it's 200 also. It hasn't done that well. They got interrupted in the act, and they scattered across the plains. And after a 3-day manhunt, they were all rounded up, and that gave the feds enough to press forward with a conspiracy case, and they indicted 20 members, Timmy and at least one brother, and some of the other mainstays of the gang, and 6 of the prostitutes. And it was a huge trial. Started out in Del Rio, they moved to El Paso. It lasted several months, and they only got 6 convictions. Timmy, Jerry Ray James, and four others, and they only served 5 years. But that was enough to really break up the gang. And when the decade rolled over, things were just different, and the kind of things that they were specialized in just weren't working very well anymore. And by then, it was also the Dixie Mafia. Was also, people were more connected throughout the South, and so. And by the way, the Overton Gang was like, they were like either started the Dixie Mafia or they were one of the main nodes of it, early on. And so Timmy gets out of prison in 1972, and he's got plans. He collected a whole lot of money while he was in prison, and he was ready to set up business again. And but definitely the people in Dallas and Fort Worth didn't want that to happen. And little Larry, I guess, saw a payday and hitting him, and so he did. So that's how the gang got busted up. Willie and Paul kind of grew out of that Dixie Mafia environment.
Yeah, Paul is definitely a character back in Fort Worth, right?
Yeah, and Dallas.
Pimp with used car deals. I mean, never played drums in his life until Willie got a call to the used car lot that needed to come to a radio station and play. Somehow, Paul became a drummer within an hour.
And then in those early years when they were still playing rough joints, like Paul was the enforcer, right? Like he brought those skills with him to the band. Yeah.
It went on for years after that. After the picnic that I was involved in, within a year or two after that, there was another one up north here that there was a big scene at the door, at the gate, and the banditos were there to let them know they were supposed to work security. And we're going to be real tough guys about it. And Paul managed to get a big piece under the lead guy's chin and said, "Well, don't you think I can handle security myself?" And backed them all down. He said, "I'm not moving until they're all gone." The guy waved them all off.
You'd said that things have changed by the new decade, that when Timmy's back out, he's not able to get back into the same life in the same way. And my understanding is that, law enforcement changed a little bit in those early years of the 1970s, but research suggests that maybe that's not so much the way. So on the one hand, like Eddie, one of the stories of the early Armadillo World headquarters was always the sense that the law didn't come down on you quite like you might have expected it. But it sounds like, too, you've learned that there was surveillance and that they were kind of watching a little bit. What was the Armadillo's relationship with law enforcement like in those years?
Well, it was, you might say standoffish until the Ken Featherston murder. And when we inadvertently, just a series of little flashes, we solved the murder for him. We had Dub Rose seeing a picture in the office that he remembered Burton had taken of him on the day that the guy we had agreed was the one that did it. You remember that was the day Burton took that picture, called Burton in California. He got back to us with and nothing flat, because he was so well organized. And he said, I took that picture. I'm sorry I can't tell you exactly when, but it was one or two or one of these 3 dates, in August of 3 years ago. And so Dub and Dub went down to the police station where, Dwayne Bailey and Jerry Spain from the police department came and worked that case, and we became real tight with them because Spain didn't believe it. We were really trying to help, but Dwayne was convinced that we weren't hiding anything. And Dub went down a couple of days later to the morgue, where they kept the booked photos, and flipped through the book to the dates and picked out John Bingham from the list there, and this is him. And so then the cops surrounded his mother's house on 33rd Street, the street where all the hippies lived back then. And it was Jim Franklin and Dub Rose and Burton Wilson did the whole thing. After they caught him, and I think he got 17 months for that killing. But after we did that, then they would come in and without knocking to the offices, because they were looking for a runaway or they were looking for somebody and they thought we might be able to give them some information. That's when they walked into my office, and I had a 20-foot table in the office that we had built out of scrap lumber and polished it all up real pretty. And Spain walked in and sat down right next to where I had been sitting, and there was a 7-inch reel-to-reel tape box full of seeds and stems and a little bit of shake, and he picked it up and started flipping it like this, and it just sounded like a baby rattle, going round and round as he flipped it. And then finally he stopped, and he was just talking, not paying any attention to it, and he stopped it, and the thumb came up in the little cutout place where you open your dictionary, and he opened it a little bit, and seeds went sprinkling on the desk and falling off into his lap, got all over his hands. And he shut it real quick, and I'm trying not to watch, or be seen watching. And he put his hands down and wiped them all over his trousers, trying to get the pot off from it. But we had a great relationship with him after that, because we always had it already, packaged up, ready to put in their car when they got there. And for the most part, except for the killing, we had a truly remarkable number of people go through with a truly remarkable small degree of violence. One major cutting that some of the banditos got some of our guys, and I remember one guy, was on the table in a doctor's office, and they'd done, 1,100 stitches on him or something. And then he got all done, and they sat him up thinking they were done, and he was the same thing on the back. And all box cutters kind of stuff.
Damn.
Yeah.
And so, some of this, too, is it seems like in the 70s, music artists and the counterculture are less of a target. There's less enforcement on, marijuana getting you 10 years on possession. You hear fewer of those stories in the 70s and the 60s. And my understanding early on was that some of this had to do with, people like Sheriff Raymond Frank, that he campaigned kind of among some of those counterculture types a little bit. But Jesse, you are taking on Raymond Frank as part of this, in some ways, a sequel to parts of the Overton Gang saga.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that, these kind of new lines of inquiry in the 1970s that you're doing?
Yeah, it kind of, his story kind of picks up where the Overton Gang dropped off, because Frank Smith was a Baptist preacher kid from Waco who was masterminding car thefts when he was 18, 19, and on his third conviction, sent to Huntsville, and got out after only 2 years, paroled Austin in the late 50s, got a pardon from Governor Allen Shivers through his, I think, fast talking with Dr. Beto, the prison director, who was also a preacher, and I don't know, maybe some cash, we might assume. And so he started this auto salvage wrecking yard and built it up until it was the biggest auto salvage in the Austin area. And then in 1974, when his buddy, Raymond Frank, was sheriff, whose campaign I believe Frank supported, got a bail bondsman license, which is kind of weird because he was still on parole for another felony conviction in 1967 for conspiracy, car theft ring, him having a wrecking yard with cars that where the titles could be switched with the cars that were stolen. Not the titles, but the VIN number. Then they used that for a title. So he's quite a character. Big guy, huge guy. And everybody who met him or dealt with him, with the exception of a very few, would say how likable he was. He was impossible not to like. He was a big storyteller, just a big guy, and but actually a really brutal criminal because with the bail bond license, he had access to every thief in the area, and he could be a puppet master and get them to do whatever he wanted. Because a lot of those guys really needed money, or they needed to pay him off for this bail bond. So he came in. A lot of these remnants of the Overton Gang I mentioned earlier were in his orbit. He had quite an empire going. He was a multimillionaire from the bail bonds and the wrecking yard, and he got into a feud with the local wrecking yard, which was actually a broker. The insurance companies would turn all their wrecked cars over to these guys, and they would hold auctions to disperse them among all the local salvage dealers, right? So this guy was a straight arrow. I grab. He was from New Orleans, and he didn't know anything about the mob or anything. Well, I know that sounds like a non sequitur, but it's true. It was a family business. And when Frank got out of jail in 1973, he was not pleased that this brokerage had started, because he was used to controlling all the wrecked car business around the area. So now he would have to bid on cars at this place instead of getting them from all the various means, not necessarily legal, that wrecking yards would get them in those days. So it just started this harassment and this weird campaign of bullying these guys. And long story short, things got worse and worse. And in October of 1976, the salvage pool caught on fire, and it was obvious that it was arson. And it came in right in the middle of all this crazy stuff with Frank. And a couple of days later, Frank sues them, demanding that they do business with him. And the next week, his yard manager, Rudolph Robinson, also sues them and makes it a racial thing, saying that they're trying to lynch him and all this stuff. And it's just so weird. This doesn't make sense. In December, they get robbed. This robber comes to the door with a monkey mask on, says, "Give me the money." Frank had just been there, paid them $15,000 for some rent cars they'd been picking up for months. And I grabs the shotgun and blows the guy away before he hits anybody. And immediately they know that, and the other two robbers run off. And so there's no question in their minds that Frank sent these guys. He had just left, paid them this money, left. Within like a couple of minutes, the robbers show up to steal the money. And I talked to Bill Cryer, one of the reporters who wrote about this stuff almost every day of the week for the Statesman, really good writer. And he said, yeah, everybody knew. There was no doubt in anybody's mind that Frank Smith was behind this. So Frank Smith is the biggest master criminal in the area. And he's just weird and stupid. But he had talked his way out of things so many times. I guess he just thought he would talk his way out of it this time. So it was there was huge publicity on this case. There was Ronnie Earl's first case after he was elected DA. And Ronnie he was already his nemesis because Ronnie was always pushing for a personal bond office where people could get recognized, released, once they were recognized as being a stable member of the community, that they had a job, and etc. They would just pay, I think, $10 or $15 to get out of jail. If they didn't show up to trial, then they'd have to pay their bond. And Frank was locally opposed to this. He was part of the lobbying group of bail bondsmen who were always trying to kill legislation recommending that. And so Ronnie was this brilliant, far-sighted guy who came up through the municipal judge, constitutional convention, legislature, judicial council, and then left the legislature to run for DA because he felt it was a place where he could really work with the law and achieve justice, not just put people in jail, but achieve justice.
And he served for a long time in that capacity, right?
Yeah, and he kept evolving the job of DA. He was doing all this stuff for restorative justice and community justice, talking circles, things that, that go back to ancient cultures where people resolve their differences through, they get together and they say like, okay, you did this to this guy and he did this to you. But really, who's hurt here? What is that violation, cost? And what would be the cost of repairing that? What do you want? What do you want? The people start talking. They work things out. Stuff like that help resolve the troubles in Northern Ireland too. It's really interesting, and it's much more than just a story about thugs, which I started out with. I always thought, this is so weird. I can't believe this happened, and there was always a lot of context and subtext in the newspaper coverage that I didn't understand. And once you just really sit on it for a long time, you start getting it. And that's the thing I like about these stories. They articulate things about the culture and the attitudes of the time in a really unique way.
Yeah, and so it's really interesting. It's like you this moment in the 1970s where there is this, residue of that kind of thug underworld, criminal families and being connected politically, but also someone like Ronnie Earl, who's bringing in this kind of new wave of, what we think of as an idealism and reform that is a big part of Austin's identity going forward into the 1980s. So those things are like clashing up against each other in this story.
Yeah, there were a lot of reformers. It was almost a cliche. This the generation of guys who grew up in the 60s getting out of law school, and they went into the system, and they were out to do things differently. And that's where Austin's personal bond office came from. And of course, a lot of the guys just went into the system and, played the game. But there were a lot of those guys like Eddie mentioned, Dave Richards. They were in there representing drug offenders, day after day. And forgot who said it, was another lawyer said, yeah, and they lost all the time, but they were in court all the time defending these guys. And
Vietnam vets' influence, I think, on that was much greater than anybody's ever pointed out. We had these, real live, proven super patriots that were driving shuttle buses and broke.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Vietnam Vets Against the War, that organization, which was pretty powerful in town.
Yeah, and the Bus Drivers Union, which is one of their big early victories. A lot of those guys also representing these outlaws. You could say it's just a lawyer making a fee, but what I've gotten from all the conversations I've had with lawyers is they tend to be less judgmental than your average person who might think like, oh, you're working for this criminal.
And I think in Ronnie Earl, maybe you have a precursor to, a new generation coming in now. Our new DA just elected is very much on that reformist wing, a young man trying to change things up. The kind of work that you're doing, digging back into the records in the newspapers and pointing out like apartment complexes where shootings or surveillance or all these things happened that you could pass by every day and not know, but like to ground it in the photo and their face at that time, or to ground it in like the physical location where they were, to think about the Chalmers courts being torn down.
Well, okay, so
thanks, Jesse, for joining us.
Sure, man, I enjoyed it. I'm going to take these headphones with me. Don't mind. Just go.
Austin Roots, executive produced by TSSI, produced by Renee O'Connor. Crybaby, courtesy of Jake Andrews Music. You need to get the memoir so you can get ready for the pop quiz. Go to threadgills.com and get Armadillo World Headquarters a memoir. Do it now. Do it right.